Good morning, church. This is the reflection of the week for the first week of November. I'm going to talk to you today, as I did the last time I did a reflection, on an attribute of God. When we think about the attributes of God, we need to remember that they are not contrary or in conflict with one another. That is, there are no contradictions or inconsistencies in the character of God. Furthermore, we need to remember that the attributes of God do not operate independently of one another. They often depend upon one another for full effect, and they reinforce one another in their operations. In my last reflection, which was on the goodness of God, that interdependence of several divine attributes is evident. As we saw in the book of Exodus, God's goodness combines in association with His love, mercy, patience, faithfulness, justice, holiness, and wrath in perfect balance with one another. Today I want to talk to you about the faithfulness of God. Faithfulness is one of the characteristics of God's ethical nature. It denotes the firmness or constancy of God in His relations with His people. It is, accordingly, one aspect of God's truth and of His unchangeableness. God is true not only because He is really God, in contrast to all that is not God, but also because He is constant or faithful in keeping His promises, and therefore He is worthy of trust. God likewise is unchangeable in His ethical nature. This unchangeableness often connects with God's goodness and mercy, and also with His constancy in reference to His covenant promises. Many biblical texts proclaim the faithfulness of God. But one of the most striking of these passages comes in an unexpected context. The text is the familiar Lamentations 3:23. The book of Lamentations was written by the prophet Jeremiah. In the prophetic book that bears his name, Jeremiah warned the nation of Judah of coming judgment of the Lord due to their sinful rebellion and disregard for Him. Jeremiah's message was not well received, and so the nation refused to heed his warnings. As a result, after a time of severe oppression, the city of Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians. The oppression they experienced included a long siege in which people literally starved to death until the nation fell in 586 BC. Jeremiah was an eyewitness to this judgment that he had prophesied. And the book of Lamentations, based upon his experiences, was a reminder of the tragic fall of Jerusalem and the burning of the temple. Written shortly after 586 BC, the content of the book lives up to its name. It is the only book of the Bible that consists only of a series of laments for the suffering the nation experienced as a consequence of their sin. Jeremiah's misery is described in chapter 3, verses 15 to 20. Listen to what those verses say. He has filled me with bitterness. He has made me drunk with wormwood. He has broken my teeth with gravel. He has made me cower in the dust. My soul has been rejected from peace. I have forgotten happiness. So I say, my strength has perished, and so has my hope from the Lord. Remember my affliction and my wandering, the wormwood and bitterness. Surely my soul remembers and is bowed down within me. Notice the misery represented in the imagery of those verses. The misery of bitterness, wormwood, broken teeth, cowering in fear, rejection and the loss of peace, a loss of happiness, strength perished, hope also gone. He calls his condition one of affliction and wandering. And together all of these circumstances bring him to a bowed spirit within himself. Those are the laments of verses 15 through 20. But in verse 21, the spirit and mood of the text change abruptly, as his focus shifts from the misery of his circumstances to the person of God in verse 21. Listen to these words. This I recall to my mind. Therefore I have hope. The Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I have hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the person who seeks him. It is good that he waits silently for the salvation of the Lord. What a dramatic shift as he refuses to allow his mind to center and to dwell upon the circumstances of his misery, but instead reminds himself of the glorious truth of the person of the God with whom he has to do. What does he recall that restores his hope? The basis for renewed hope is God's great love. The Hebrew word that is here translated loving kindness is sometimes translated as covenant love or loyal love, a word that has the basic meaning of loyalty or faithfulness, especially as related to the covenant initiated by God with his people Israel. Another basis of hope is God's unfailing compassions, a word that describes the tender, loving care of a mother. These compassions, he says, are experienced in a fresh and new way every day. They never fail. He further declares the faithfulness of God. The meaning of this word, as we've already noted, is connected to truth, faith, and trustworthiness, constancy, and reliability. Verse 23 is the best known verse in Lamentations, memorialized by the popular hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness. I encourage you to sing through that hymn sometime today and note the number of characteristics of God connected to his faithfulness in that great hymn. It truly is a song of great theological depth and insight. Contrary to the way that neighboring peoples viewed their gods, the Jews came to know that they served a God who was faithful to them. And there is no greater hope than knowing that God is totally reliable. And that God that Israel knew as her God is the same God who has saved us by his grace through the work of his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Often in life, people do not realize the faithfulness of God until the bottom has fallen out of their lives. In Lamentations chapter 3, the faithfulness of God is seen against the backdrop of extreme suffering and misery. In times of our own suffering, we can choose to wallow in the misery of bitterness and hopelessness, or we can choose to remind ourselves of the unfailing promises of God and of his faithfulness to keep them. Great is thy faithfulness, O God, my Father.